Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And tonight we're going to talk about the Betassos and how mountain living gives you one shorter leg. And Cheryl Whitehall, our Volunteer Ranger Corps volunteer, is going to be our main presenter and share this story, which this program actually began during a program about a year ago. At the end of the session, I said, who has ideas for programs? And Cheryl said, we should do one on the Betassos. So that's wonderful. And we started planning right about that time. And here we go, we're doing the program. And I am Cheryl Kippen, Cultural History Program Coordinator with Boulder County Parks and Open Space. And I'm going to have Cheryl Whitehall unmute herself and take it away. Thank you all so much.
Okay, to prepare for this program, we listened to two oral interviews with Ernie. One was in 1976, not too long after May had died, and actually after the Boulder County had bought the land around Ernie's house. And that interview was done with Susan B. Levin. And then the next interview was done in 1983, and this was done with John Hess. And it was just shortly before Ernie died from a heart attack. And the title itself came from Ernie. In one of the interviews, he said, everything that he cared about was in the mountains overlooking Boulder. And when you live in the mountains, you get one leg shorter than the other. The next slide shows me meeting the Betassos. Well, not me actually, but shows a picture of the Betassos, Ernie and May. And we met, my husband, Cal, and I met Ernie and May in 1972 in January when we moved to Sugarloaf. And we used to like to run up the water treatment plant and around the back of the water treatment plant and back down, which went by Ernie's front yard. Ernie and May were just wonderful, great neighbors. They would have us in for pie and coffee, and they didn't have kids. So I think they kind of like that young couple that lived across Sugarloaf and that had the little baby. And one of my early memories was of Ernie with his herd, driving his herd down Sugarloaf. One morning, I woke up and I saw him driving his herd down Sugarloaf, and I thought, coming from Chicago, I was in the Old West. I was just so happy. And if you look at this picture, it's a bunch of cowboys from Sugarloaf, and the far left is Ernie. And we are not really sure about too many of the other ones, but we think we can point out one person, the young man next to Ernie may be in one of the pictures later on. Sue Hendrickson and Carl lived a little bit up Sugarloaf from me, but Sue, I contacted her and she gave me some information too. One of the things that she remembers and she feels just fortunate to have done is that she was invited to help with a short cattle drive, not the big long one that would go down Sugarloaf, over the canyon, up Magnolia, over the peak to peak, and then up the Rollins Pass Road, but a shorter one when Ernie wanted to move his cattle from upper Sugarloaf down to around his house. She said, the protocol was to meet at the Betassos house at 5:30 in the morning, be greeted with a smile, and handed a small glass of schnapps. We then saddled up, mostly on Ernie's horses, and went up the hill. Now then, once we were on the horses, no one wanted to dismount, as Boomer, that was Ernie's dog, would attack you if you were on the ground. And Ernie never had any trouble getting support for his cattle drives, which included, like I said, taking them all the way up to the Rollins Pass Road. Now, Ernie's dog. Ernie's dog, Boomer, had a real reputation. This is Ernie with his dog. And I have two little stories about Ernie's dog, Boomer. One day my husband was running up the water treatment plant road and Ernie was in the front yard and he yelled out, "Hey, Cal, if you want to run a little faster up the hill, I can let Boomer out. He'll chase you up the hill." And that was funny. But then the next incident was not so funny. Cal and I were in the car and we had our son, our baby in the car too. And Cal decided he wanted to ask Ernie a question. So we drove over to their house and Boomer he looked to be quite asleep on the porch, all snoozy doggy like. And Cal got out of the car. I didn't, I stayed in the car, but Cal got out of the car, put one hand on the gate to open it up, and Boomer shot up in the air, snarling at my husband's face, nose to face. And Ernie came out, he calmed Boomer down, and then he said to my husband, "Cal, didn't you see that sign?" And yes, there was a big sign that said, "Beware of dog." And Rich Koopman also has a story about Boomer the dog. Rich Koopman, former Parks and Open Space Resource Planning lead, says, "I came to understand the protocol of honking my horn in the driveway so Ernie could come out of the house and lock Boomer in his truck so that when I stepped out of my vehicle, I would not be attacked." And Sue Hendrickson, the neighbor, said that actually Ernie had another dog prior to Boomer, and that dog's name was Badger, and he was actually a very, very friendly dog.
It's before Boomer.
Now, this is another of Ernie's favorite things, and was inherited by Boulder County Parks and Open Space when they bought the property. It's Ernie's truck, and it has been restored. And here you can see it in the Boulder County Fair Parade. Ernie's truck is a 1954 International R120 flatbed pickup truck. We're not sure if Ernie purchased it new or if he got it secondhand. But on the right, we have what is left of the invoice and the vehicle specs, and it's not a bill of sale. Now then, we wanted to talk a little bit about the Betassos. Stephen Betasso, his father, and then also his mother, Mary. Stephen, Ernie's father, came to the United States in 1884 from Italy, and he worked the coal mines in Pennsylvania. And here are records of two of his trips between Italy and the United States in the 1880s. But we feel that he made many, many more trips. Now, the next ship record that we have is for Stephen coming back with his new wife, Mary. And he married his Italian sweetheart in 1893. And her name was Mary. Well, we've got two different spellings. One was Mary Betasso. One was Mary Pastore, and one was Mary Patore. We know from Ernie it was, and from also something else that we'll talk about later, it was actually Pastore. And if you look up above, you can see there was another misspelling, and we found quite a few misspellings. Up here they have Betasso, but we know also that it was Betasso. Sources say that they did come over and they returned to Pennsylvania. And then eventually they took a train out west to the Marshall area to work the coal mines. But some of these records said that they actually went from Italy, New York, straight to Chrisman, but we don't really think so. Now then, Stephen and his mining. Stephen was a coal miner in Marshall, but only in the wintertime. The coal in Marshall was very low grade, probably a low grade bituminous coal. And they had to mine it in the summertime. I'm sorry, they had to mine it in the wintertime and burn it immediately. But in the summertime, then the coal miners would go up to all the gold and silver mines that were west of Boulder and in the mountains. The Betassos made their home in Chrisman, and they had 5 children, 4 boys and 1 girl. And Ernie really enjoyed his childhood. Susan Belevin asked him at what time in one of the interviews, and it was so fun hearing Ernie's voice. I really loved it. But she asked him, well, what kind of games did you play when you were a child? And he started laughing. He said, games? We didn't really have any games. We all had our chores that we had to do. And Ernie really admired both of his parents, but he was especially admired his mother. And he admired her because she was so hard working. And he also added in this tape that his wife, May, was just like his mom. And he said that if it weren't for the women on the ranches couldn't have made it. The women made the ranches go. His mom had a huge garden. She did a lot of canning for the winter time, and they lived off the land. She baked her own bread. She made her own cheese and her own butter. And they would go to Boulder to get supplies, but only like 2 or 3 times a year. And at that point, they would buy like 400 pounds of flour and 200 pounds of sugar. And Susan asked him, well, did your mom make her own pasta? And he said, no, my mom ordered her pasta from an import house in Denver. And he also added, you know, we ate a lot of pasta. Italians really like their pasta. And also he said he felt a little uncomfortable when he went down to Boulder. He felt just with all those fancy people, he loved Sugarloaf. He felt very much at home on Sugarloaf. But when he got into Boulder, he kind of felt like a hillbilly. And we do not know much about Maybelle, the oldest girl. She's kind of a mystery. She was born in 1895, I believe, but we know a little bit that when she was living at home and also from the 1910 census. She was the oldest Betasso, and then came Ray, and Ernie was the youngest, and Maybelle, and it could be Mabel. We've seen Mabel, we've seen Maybelle also, but she was at least 10 years older than Ernie. And one of the other Betassos was Julius Betasso. And Julius had a very, very short life. And this is his tombstone. You can see this tombstone in the Green Mountain Cemetery. And it's got Julius, it's a shared tombstone. You've got Julius was born in 1900, and then his death in 1919. And Stephen, born in 1857, died in 1939. Mary, born in 1870 and died in 1949. But what happened, and then here you've got his draft card also. He, like many young men, wanted to fight in World War I. And he was shipped to Kansas City. And at this point, in 1918, this was the Spanish flu. And he, like many other young soldiers, got the flu and died. The next slide will be of the Blanchard cabin, which a lot of you probably have seen if you've gone up the Betasso Road. As you go up the road, it's the little cabin off to the right and down in the draw. And I was always under the mistaken idea that Ernie was born here. He was not. He was born in Chrisman. This cabin was bought, well, the land was bought from the Blanchards. And what happened was that the Betasso family living in Chrisman would a lot of times walk over the hill or the mountain, and they would walk down to this property. It had been homesteaded by the Blanchards, and they say it was proven out, meaning that the Blanchards could then sell it. And the Blanchards had moved down to where Chapman Road, lower on the canyon, begins today, and what I call the Red Lion Inn area. And it's actually a wedding venue right now. The main house was being built up above. But what was interesting to me about this cabin, there were 7 people in the family. And if you've seen this cabin, you know how tiny this cabin is. And I can't imagine today thinking that 7 people would live in a cabin that small. There was a spring behind the cabin, and they could get fresh water there. And if you go down to this cabin, which I hope you do, if you go to the door on the side, you will see Ernie's initials in the door frame, and they were put there with bullet casings, which is kind of a fun thing to find out. The house itself, which is a red brick house, as you go up the road, you'll see this is the house that Stephen built for his family. And he bought the lumber and the bricks from a brick and lumber yard down where Casey Middle School is today. But if you look at the lower part of this house and the foundation, you'll see the stone that's there. And these stones are from the actual Betasso property. And Ernie's father, Stephen, built this house up above so that he could tap into the Silver Lake water supply. And Dick lived in this house with his parents because Dick was the one that ran the ranch. He lived in there, and then Ernie and May lived in the white clapboard house, which is right across the street or the road. And Dick died in 1964. Ernie and May then moved into this red brick house, and they remodeled it in 1966. And the Betassos, they all were industrious. They all worked very hard. They had 100 chickens, hens that would lay eggs. They sold those down to the restaurants in Boulder. And eventually, they decided they wanted to acquire more land and have a bigger herd of cattle. So they bought the ranch from the McDonald Ranch up above on Sugarloaf for $5 an acre in 1924. Eventually, they bought more property. And today, if you're living in Mountain Meadows or Mountain Pines or Pride of the West, that used to be owned by the Betassos. They actually owned over 2,000 acres. And this is a family photo in front of the little cabin where they all lived. We see Mary on the right, Stephen, and then Dick and Ernie. And I would presume that Ernie there is the smallest one. And Ernie actually began school up at Chrisman. And he then, when they moved down to the Sugarloaf property, he would walk over the hill down to the canyon and to the little one-room schoolhouse that's down there, El Vado, and then he continued going to school there. And an interesting story that came up on the interviews was that while Ernie and the family were living in Chrisman, the family decided to put in a telephone because their two older children, Maybelle and Ray, had gone down to Boulder High to go to school, and they were living with a family down in Boulder, and they wanted to talk to their kids, so they installed a telephone. And the interesting thing to me about that was the fact that at that point in Chrisman, there were only 3 telephones. One was at the mine, and of course the miners probably couldn't use that one. One was at the general store, and they had to pay to use that telephone. But once the Betassos installed their telephone, they let the neighbors use the telephone. And that was just the Betasso way of doing things, being generous, being good, friendly neighbors. I'm sure it was a social occasion, but it benefited everybody. It is said that in 1920, the Betasso family bought a car, but only Ray, the oldest of the family, knew how to drive it. And then he decided to go work the mines up in Caribou, and he left the car, and it just sat around, I guess, in the barn for quite a while because no one knew how to drive the car. Of course, eventually they figured it out, but at first it just sat there. Now then, talk a little bit about the train that the train, of course, came up, was built because of the mining. And you can, we have a map here of where the train went. And it was called the Colorado and Northwestern Railroad. It went as far as Wall Street in 1898. And if you look at this, if you and I know it's a small and it's a little difficult to see all the writing, but start over in the right, and that's Boulder. It would go up along Boulder Canyon and the creek, and then it would turn off at 4 Mile. And if you keep going up a little bit, you will come to Chrisman, and that's where the Betassos were living at that time. Keep going up a little higher up over the hump, and that's Salina. And then go to the left and you will see Sunset. Keep going up and you've got Mount Alto, then Gold Hill, Brainerd, and all the way up to Newmarket. If you come down this and take the other spur, if you come down, you'll come down to Bald Mountain. You go left, you see Glacier Lake. And what was interesting here is I guess the Betassos would take the train sometimes on 4th of July for the celebration at Glacier Lake. But if you continue coming on down, you'll see where the train went to the Bluebird Mine, then it went to the Cardinal Mine, Caribou Mine, and then even as far down as the town of Eldora. And if you then go right, it went over to the Barker Reservoir. It was a pretty long train. Of course, it was a narrow gauge, like a 4% grade, like all the mountain trains. And the problem was, you won't find these tracks at all today. But the problem was, is after World War I, it started losing money, and the company decided to dismantle it and sell like the rails to other train companies in California. And they even went, the rails even went as far as Kobe, Japan. And today you can ride that train. No, I'm sorry, you cannot ride the train, but you can ride your mountain bike on what we call today the Switzerland Trail. It's a nice, it's a 4% grade. It's pretty rocky in some places, but it is good for mountain biking. This is what Chrisman looked like back in the day. It was a pretty large community, and it had a schoolhouse here. There was a post office and a general store, and it was a pretty thriving community. The problem today is that we're not quite sure, at least Cheryl and I are not, if there's anything particularly left. A friend of mine and I, in fact, Linda, we drove up 4 Mile, and I had an Avenza map, and I was looking for Chrisman, and what we came to was there's a drive. It says it's a private drive, and it's called Chrisman Drive on one side, but it's further up from where Chrisman actually was. We decided to walk down 4 Mile, and Linda spotted these wooden steps going up the side of the mountain. Now, these wooden steps are old. They're kind of rickety, but I was wondering, would this be a way to get up to Chrisman? And I started walking up the steps, and I got to that place where it looks like it might be a stone wall, and I could see on my map that I had to go right. Well, I went right, but then I also realized I was on private property, and it wasn't National Forest and it wasn't BLM. It was private property. In fact, I went far enough that I could have probably knocked on somebody's back door. And I thought, it's time to turn around and go back. I'm going to get back into the miners, Ernie and Ray. And Ernie quit school in the 8th grade. He wanted to become a miner, and he became what they called in those days a mucker. He carried the debris away from the mine. And he worked at Poor Man, and some of you will recognize these names because they're names of roads up there, like off of 4 Mile, except, and also even off of Sugarloaf. But he worked at the Poor Man, he worked at Gold Hill, Salina, and even worked at the tungsten mine up in Nederland during World War II. In one of the books that we found, this is from D. Bailey's book, which is called Boulder County Miners. And they show the hand, or an outline of the hand, of Ray Betasso and then Ernie Betasso on the right. And what was interesting to us was, look at who made the drawing around the hand. It was somebody by the name of Charles Pastore, which was Mary's maiden name. So we know her name also was Pastore. It shows the mines that they worked at. Like here, Ray worked at the Acme, the April Fool, the Grandview, the Mills. And his position was a mine foreman. And the location was like in Boulder Canyon, Sunshine Canyon, and once again in Boulder Canyon. The one on the right, the mines that it shows here, Ernie worked in the Forest Homes, the Mills, and the April Fool mine. And his position was a machine man and also a millman. And his location was Hurricane Hill and Boulder Canyon. Now then, let's get into Ernie and May and how they met a little bit. And this is a record of their marriage license in 33. But it's also, there's a picture of May. She is the second girl from the left. And the marriage license, once again, we've got a misspelling and we know it's wrong. It says wife's name is Mary Foote. It was not Mary Foote, we know, and Ernie said it was Mary Toots. There were dances, many dances on Sugarloaf up at what I'm going to say is, if you know the area on Sugarloaf, it was around Station 1 up above. And these dances were very popular. They were social occasions. It was people could get together, they could meet people. It was also a way for young people to meet other young people and maybe get some couples going. And the ranchers' wives formed a club. It was called the Sunshine Club, and they would make pies, cakes, cookies, and they would have a pot of coffee. But Ernie added in one of the interviews that during Prohibition, there were always a few bottles roaming around too. And Ernie adds in one of these interviews that Sugarloaf was a real community. He believed it was a real community until World War II. And then he said, well, men were drafted, young men were drafted, and then other young men went off to work in the defense industry. So things kind of changed. One of the things that he added up at where Station 1 is right now, they did have a town hall, they had a post office, and there was a general store. You couldn't buy anything fresh in that general store. It was all canned goods, but there was always tobacco. May helped run the ranch with Ernie's brother, Dick. Dick never married, and he was the rancher. Ernie was the miner. Ernie enjoyed the mining. They did have at least 125 herd of cattle until Dick's death, and then it became much smaller. Ernie enjoyed, and one of the questions from Susan B. Levin was that she asked Ernie if he liked to ride horses, and Ernie said, yeah, I like to ride horses, and I wasn't too bad. And he would ride when they took the herd over to up to Toland area or Toll area. And May, then the other question was, well, did May ride with you? And Ernie said, well, she did, but she really preferred staying at home, especially with the cows during calving season. And Sue said that Ernie leased, after May died, he leased his cattle to Toll because it just wasn't the same. May used to help him pull the calves out of the birthing canal, and Ernie just really didn't enjoy doing that as much. One of the things I found interesting, just the whole cattle drive on up to the Rollins Pass Road was fascinated me. They would go up to the Mammoth Basin below James Peak, and they would rent Boulder Park from the tolls, and you all probably know Tolan, and that is where the tolls used to live. And one of the things was is they would rent pasture land from the National Forest, and they usually didn't take the cattle up until like middle of July or late July because they wanted the grasses to be nice and lush. But the National Forest made sure that these ranchers owned land. They were the ranchers, because what had happened prior to this, speculators would buy a herd of cattle like in Denver, bring it up, fatten them up, and hardly pay anything to the National Forest. Well, the National Forest wanted the ranchers to have the rights to using the pasture. Now then, we can't stress enough that the Betassos were good neighbors. I know that for a fact. Sue and Carl know that also. And this is a picture of Ernie and May with some friends, the Skates. Edith Skates is on the left, and then May, and then Dick, and Ernie, of course, on the right with this big smile on his face. Sue Hendrickson, she wrote quite a bit about Ernie and knowing the Betassos. And she said, I asked May what she thought of all the people moving into the area. This was probably 40 years ago. This would be during the 70s. And May said, Sue, I felt so lonely up here. I'm happy to have new neighbors. Don Cumley wrote a book, The Lives and Times of the Sugarloaf Community. And if you're interested in getting a copy of this book, the Boulder Library has it. You can get it from them. There's a lengthy chapter in there about the Betassos, and the chapter was written by Glenna Carline. And she begins the whole chapter, and it's a lengthy chapter. Ernie Betasso. I can't think about him without smiling. What a legacy of stories, sayings, history, wisdom, honor, caring, and love he left for us. And she wrote, and I knew this too, Ernie was really a generous man, and he would lend money to people that were down on their luck. And like maybe there was a young couple that wanted to buy a cabin, he would lend them money. And especially to minors' widows so that they could take care of their families after the death of their husband. And one of the other stories that I enjoyed was in the 70s on Sugarloaf. I remember this. There were a lot of young people running around in the mountains, and they wanted to live off the land. And of course, they were hippies. But Ernie described them as lonely kids who couldn't get along with their folks. And he and May would hire them to do odd jobs. And also, they knew that they could have dinner. They would be invited in for supper. And more than likely, they would have one of May's famous apple pies. And Sue adds a personal memory here. She said one of her very good memories was she stopped at their house one day and asked if they had seen one of her sons. I was concerned, Sue said, because our son had left us a note saying not to worry, Mom and Dad. He would be gone for a couple days. He just needed some time to sort things out, but he was only in high school. And so, yeah, we were worried. Well, Ernie said to Sue, he's growing up. And that would be Ernie. That was great. Now then, we've got some pictures here that they're unidentified. And if any of you out in the audience here know anything, you can add it, please, during question and answer time. I'm going to turn this part over to the other Cheryl, except for the top two photos. I am absolutely certain these two top photos are on top of Sugarloaf Mountain. Sugarloaf Mountain, if you climb up to Sugarloaf Mountain, it's not a really long hike. It's like a mile and a half or a mile and 3/4 maybe. You get up on top and it is wonderful. You have a 360-degree view of everything below. It's really worth it. And Cheryl's going to take over now because she has more ideas about who these people might be than I do.
Well, we tried to kind of figure out who some of these people might be in these unidentified Betasso photos. And I know the photos are probably pretty small for you all, but we've managed to kind of see who some of the folks might be. We're thinking that this picture here in the bottom left, that might be May's sisters, because we saw them earlier, younger, and it kind of looks like perhaps that could be them. We're not sure. We are thinking in this picture down here at the bottom right that maybe the lady is Betty, Ray's brother Ray's wife. I don't know if it's Ray next to her. His face is in shadow, but we would think if perhaps it's her, then perhaps it would be the couple. So we're not sure. Generally, when we see someone in a hat like this gentleman here, it's a good tip off that it might be Ernie because he usually wore a hat. And so, that's kind of a good clue there. Let's see if I can get it to go to the next page. We're thinking that these pictures were all taken at the same time because a lot of people have the same outfits on in the pictures, and they're the same ages in each picture. We're thinking a special occasion, maybe like nowadays, perhaps a funeral. Perhaps we're thinking maybe Mom Mary's funeral in 1949. We're not quite sure, but I don't think it's 1939 for Dad's funeral, Stephen's, because too many women are wearing pants, I'm kind of thinking, for 1939, but I don't know. So we'll see. We kind of think this is Ernie here again. And we're not quite sure who the lady is. We do not think that it's May. Probably one of these others in the picture. Now, this young man here looks kind of like the young man that was in the picture at the very beginning of our slideshow, who was with the horses, but we don't know who he is. And I think he's probably with the young lady that's next to him, but we don't know who she is for sure either. So that's kind of interesting. I'm thinking this is probably either Ray or Dick, and then again, Betty, Ray's wife. And, you can kind of get an idea of who's who, but not quite sure. So, whichever brother's not in the picture is probably the one that took the picture as well. Let's see here. And here we have another photo that has maybe May's sisters in it again. We're just not quite sure. We don't know if this is Mother Mary or not, and when this picture was taken. We just, some things we are not sure of. Here's that young lady that was with that young man that was maybe in the horse picture earlier. We don't know who she is. We don't think that this is Mom Mary, because I think at this time she would have been older than that. And the last picture we saw of her way back in front of the Blanchard cabin, her build looked a little bit different than that. But who knows? We don't know for sure. And again, some of these same folks, in the back of one of these pictures, it said that this was Charles Pastore. Remember, he was in the miner's book, with the information about Ernie and Ray. So perhaps he's Mom Mary's nephew because of the same last name, which was her maiden name. We're not sure. So just kind of some detective work that's been a lot of fun to do. And maybe you all do know these things. So, all right.
Okay, this is in 1976, and this tombstone, you can see Richard on the top, 1905 to 1964, May 1913 to 1976, and Ernie 1907 to 1983. And this tombstone can be found in Green Mountain, and actually it's really close to the road. After May's death, Ernie sold most of the land around the house to Boulder County. He and May had talked about this, and they both wanted it to be sold for Boulder County Parks and Open Space. They didn't want to sell it off for more subdivisions. They wanted everybody to enjoy what they enjoyed about Sugarloaf. Former Parks and Open Space Resource Planning Lead, Rich Koopman, says, Ernie's willingness to sell their homestead and the last mountain land holdings for public open space caps off a family legacy that is enjoyed now and will be for many future generations. Rich adds that the Parks Department was less than 5 years old at that time, this is 1976, and a beehive of activity trying to get operating guidelines and programs established to meet some of the expectations of the county commissioners, or POSAC. And the residents who lobbied for the open space program. The three new jewels of the department were big ones: Walker Ranch on Flagstaff, Betasso, and Rock Creek, which is out there on 287. All three of these demanded equal priority for our limited staff resources. He adds, Ernie was the ever-present face of the Betasso Preserve, personable, easygoing, and a visionary who stepped up and took a chance on a new local government program that could preserve his family property as open space for the public to enjoy in the future. And I want to close by having you listen to about 2 minutes of one of the interviews. And it's everything we've said tonight about Ernie Betasso and the Betasso family, how they love people and they were willing to have new people come.
ones that are bitching about the other people, they ought to go back wherever they come from.
But I think there's not a sense of community these days that, from talking to you and Ernie Ross and Ralph Gates and Ellen, that there seemed to have been, everybody went visiting each other. I don't know a lot of people who live around here. I wonder, I guess it's my fault.
Well, I suppose it is. If you go visit your neighbor, every one of my neighbors that I have that I say is good neighbors, like Kathy and Ron and all my good neighbors over in the Tall Timbers and Mountain Meadows, and everyone that I've ever met and talked to, they want to be friends. Never did meet one that didn't want to be friendly. And so if you want to be a friend, and you remember this, you got to have a friend, you got to be a friend. And if you want to be a neighbor, you got to be a neighbor. You get on your horse and stop by and talk to them. And if they're not busy, I'll bet you every one of them will talk to you. And you try that. Right. So that's the way it is. You got to kind of lead out maybe first a little bit yourself. Right?
You're right. You are right. That's wisdom.
Well, it's not wisdom. It's just a matter of getting along with people. You can get along with people if you try. But you find people that everybody lives a little bit different. But just because he lives different, that don't mean that you don't like him. You run your household possibly a little bit different than I'd run mine. And if I go to your house, why, the old saying is, when you go to Rome, you do like the room.
Okay. That is the end of our presentation. And we would like to hear from you now. If you have any questions or any information, anything about those pictures that we're not sure about. And I see Sue and Carl Hendrickson. I really appreciated all the information that you both gave us. And so, are there any questions?
It looks like there's something in the chat. Let me see what's in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, they're asking about the map, and I suspect it's the map of the Switzerland Trail Railroad. And yes, we could certainly send that to people. I will make a note right here about that and try to send it your way, because it is pretty neat. It's pretty cool. So.
And I will add, I've got up, you're not going to see me for a minute. I will add that there is a book about the Switzerland Trail of America. It was written by Forrest Crossen, Crossen. I happen to have a copy of it because my mother was very interested in the Switzerland Trail and she bought a copy, but it is out of print and I don't know if you can get it. I kind of doubt that it is also at the library.
I think the Lions or the Elks Club in Boulder used to sell it and have a few copies. I don't know if they still do or not, but that might be possible. And we do have Rich Koopman on with us tonight. And Rich, while folks are maybe thinking of, oh, we've got some other things in the chat, but while folks are maybe thinking of their questions, do you have anything you'd like to add, Rich? You're on mute, Rich.
I forget about that little microphone down there in the corner. I dealt quite a bit with the three nieces of Ernie's after, well, right before he died and after he died. They were all daughters of Rays. And up until 2017, at least one of them was still alive. One of the stories I gleaned from them is that Mabel's name was really not her birth name. She indicated when, and she showed her birth certificate to Betty Ray, was one of the nieces. And she said when she was in the first grade at Chrisman School, there were so many Marys in the class that the teacher looked at her and said, from now on, you're going to be Mabel. So she went home and told her parents, my name is now Mabel. Her birth name was Maria It's Juana. That's on her birth certificate. So it was interesting how a teacher had influence over first grade kids. The other story I wanted to share was when Ernie's pickup came to the county, it was my understanding that Forrest Cook was Ernie's attorney. When Ernie passed away, they couldn't figure out what to do with the horses. And the two horses then went to the attorney's secretary because she had acreage on which to put them. Some years later, they showed up on my doorstep down at the Parks and Open Space Annex in Boulder. And they asked me if we would be interested in getting Ernie's truck. And I asked them what happened, and they said the two horses got old and they passed away, and they wanted to donate the truck to the county. Then they shared the story of how they ended up with the truck. They got the two horses after Ernie died. They rented a horse trailer to try to move the horses. They managed to get one of them in the trailer. And while they were trying to catch the second one, the first one was kicking the heck out of the inside of that trailer. Somebody had the wisdom, I guess, to back Ernie's truck up to one of those dirt ramps that he had on the ranch. The two horses walked right up into the truck. So the secretary got not only the two horses, but they got Ernie's truck. And they kept it until the two horses were gone, and now the county has it. And as you saw in the pictures, it's been rehabbed, repainted, in great shape. Ernie probably wouldn't even recognize it if he were alive today.
And I see in the chat that Ted has a boomer story to tell. So go for it, Ted.
Sure. Well, Deborah and I were fortunate enough to meet Ernie. Very friendly, just as everybody said. We'd be sitting out on our deck and Ernie would just drive by, pull in the driveway, come and sit down and have a visit. And but Deborah and I were walking through the park one day and Ernie was walking Boomer, but Ernie was in his pickup. And Boomer was trotting along outside and he stopped and goes, "Hey, Ted." And I walked over and touched the truck. And that's when Boomer took control of the situation. Didn't take me long to not talk to Ernie that day. So, but no, he was very friendly and, just like everybody said, he was amazing, what he would do for two young kids who had just moved up there. Because we lived right on the corner of Broken Fence and Betasso.
He would have us over for tea, and it was just lovely. And he would talk about May a lot. In fact, he talked about May so much, I thought that I had met her, but obviously I didn't because we moved here in '79 and she had already passed. But I really thought I'd met her because of how much he talked about her. So.
And we have a question in the chat. Wasn't there a book about the Betassos? And Julianne, I don't think Cheryl and I have found it, but maybe there is one out there somewhere. There should be. Maybe we need to write one if there's not, huh? So, but maybe some of the rest of you know if there is. So
I'm wondering if that would be Don Cumley's, which is about a lot of the ranchers up there on Sugarloaf. And there is a lengthy chapter in there, like I mentioned.
Dee Bailey also had a section in her book about the Betassos, her book about mining in Wall Street and surrounding areas. So it's probably a series of pieces here and there that make up the story of the Betassos.
right, I think that chapter about the Betassos is in Dee Bailey's God's Country USA book,
Correct.
I believe. So yeah.
Yes.
All right. Anything else anybody would like to share, or even memories of hiking and doing things at Betasso?
It's a
I
very
had a question. Did you ever hear what Ernie meant when he said if you live in the mountains, you have one leg shorter? Did you ever see?
I just think that that was Ernie's, he had a great way of expressing himself. I think it was just the fact that you are walking on a hill all the time and one leg's higher up on the hill. And it's just his way of talking about always being in the mountains, which he loved.
Yeah.
And I see that Lily has Forest Cross and Switzerland Trail book that I think she's going to hold up to the screen. So, yeah.
Well, my husband's a lover of narrow gauge, but I've met Forrest Croson way back in 1973. I was at his house through a friend of mine. They were invited for lunch. But anyway, but this is my husband's thing, not mine. So
Great.
I've got a whole bunch of things. So obviously in great condition. So I see the last edition was done in 1992. I just pulled it up and I found that map that you were just talking about. Robinson Press, Fort Collins. I'm sure you can get this at the library. 1962, 1978, 1992. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good.
Can I ask a question?
Certainly.
Is the Betassos house and the White House, are those the ranger stations houses?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes. Yes.
and also I got the book a few years ago. We've only been here 9 years, so I got it maybe 5 years ago at the Elks. There was a Christmas bazaar and I bought the book there, so they still might have copies.
Okay, that would be good.
Very good.
One other story. I don't know. There. How do I get on? I don't.
Oh, you're on, Sue. We see you and we hear you.
I'm on. Okay.
Wonderful.
One story about Ernie and one of the cabins that he had was very when young people were camped out all over the place. And I remember hearing stories about the guy over at 4 Mile, and he and his sons would sit on their front decks with their guns saying, "Don't any damn hippies come my way." And Ernie found some guy down, he had a cabin that was very close to Sugarloaf Road then. And this guy was wanted to stay in it. And Ernie went down to talk to him and he said, and the guy was a little nonplussed. And he said, well, he really would like to stay if it was all right. And Ernie said, well, that's just fine as long as you cut your hair. And so the guy cut his hair and stayed. And when Ernie died, it was Mabel that arranged his funeral. And it just had nothing to do because he kept talking about Ernest and nobody knew who Ernest was really. But anyway, so then a group of Sugarloaf people said, okay, we got to have another funeral. And that was held up on Betasso land. And one of the guys came to tell a story about, and it wasn't the same one that had cut his hair for the cabin, but he was living in one of the other cabins. And he told a story about Ernie, about going up with his lady friend and saying he wanted to get married on Ernie's land. And Ernie and May said that was fine. And May cooked and cooked and cooked, and they had this wonderful party for them. And the guy was telling, he was crying as he was talking about it. It was a beautiful story. So just another example of Ernie and May and how they responded to people.
Yeah, I can add to that, Sue, if I may. Yeah, we all went down to Ernie's funeral, a little church on 9th Avenue. And just like Sue said, the minister referred to him as Ernest, and obviously had never met him, didn't even know any stories about Ernie. So we gathered outside the church and said, that's not right. Let's get together and have our own memorial service. How about next Sunday? Pass the word. So the word was passed, and we gathered on Ernie's property, which now is open space, and we gathered in the area beyond what now has the picnic shelter on it. and all sat on the hillside, and we didn't know what was going to happen. And people kind of kicked me and said, "Hey, this was all your idea. You got to stand up there." So I told an Ernie story or two and opened it up. And of course, as those things go, nobody says anything for a while. I thought, oh my. And then people started to talk. And as Sue said, this one guy stood up, and he wasn't a hippie. He looked like a modern day yuppie. I think he had a tennis racket in his hand. He was obviously going down on a Sunday morning to play tennis. And he told this story about Ernie and how wonderful Ernie had been to him. And the stories went on and on. Too bad that was before the day of iPhones and where people could record things easily, because it was an absolutely wonderful moment.
That's great. Thank you. And Susan has a question in the chat. She says, is there a story about the McDonald cabin off the hiking trail? And I'm not familiar with what she's talking about, but some of the rest of you certainly probably are. So
That's the one that was down behind. Wasn't it?
Yeah, in back.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
And
would see that. I don't know. I mean, I've been in the cabin, I've been down there and everything, but I don't know any of the stories about it.
Yeah, I don't know anything.
Yeah.
We always called that one the Ronald McDonald cabin. It was another homestead that the Betassos had bought out. And one of the unique pieces of it is it had an all metal single hole outhouse with no roof that sat behind the cabin. And there was a little ravine back up to the northwest, which had a plum orchard in it. And we could never figure out why that plum orchard was there, but it was in the upper end of a draw. So obviously it got water during the spring runoffs at least. And the trees are relatively short compared to plum orchards, which suggested that they either didn't have a ladder or they wanted to make it easy to pick. And some years ago, not too long ago, the county actually, there's one or two of those that are still alive. The county actually took some cloning material off of that and sent it up to CSU to see if they could propagate those trees again. And I don't know what happened since then, because I retired before all of that came to be. So that's something I know about the cabin. Shortly after the county purchased the property, there were actually a couple of vagrants back there that tried to burn the thing down. So there was a small fire that burned the area around the cabin and then back up the hill ways.
thank you, Rich. All right. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to share? I would hope that Ernie would have had some good things to share with us and would think this program was kind of cool. Maybe he would have even been a little bit embarrassed. I don't know. So
Yeah, good. Yeah. I can't think of anything else. Can you?
Cheryl, if you would like me to, I do have a poem that was written by one of his nieces, Betty Ray, right after he passed away.
Yes. would you
certainly.
please read it?
It's called Uncle Ernie. It says, Ernie was a special guy, but you know that already. He was a cowboy first and last, his friendship sure and steady. He didn't care for fancy clothes or lots of high-priced things. What counted most with Ernie was the stuff that laughter brings. The mountains were like home to him. He traveled in those hills. The ranch and all the folk he knew gave him the joy that fills. We loved him best because we knew however far we roam, Ernie would always welcome us to visit him at home. Now he is gone and we shall miss his open smile, his bear hug embrace, but he is left to join his May in a better and much happier place.
Thank you.
So nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Well, if that's all we have, That's wonderful. I will send out the map of the Switzerland Trail to you all, and that title of the Forest Crossing book. And so glad you joined us tonight. Have a wonderful autumn and holiday season, and take care. And if you have ideas for more programs like this, do let me know when I send out that email and reply to the email, because just like Cheryl, you too can work together and we can plan a program together. And I think it's been a lot of fun. So I think we've learned a lot tonight.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care
you.
all.
Thank you.
Cheryl.
Thanks.
Thank you.